De Niro or DiCaprio? Which planet is closest to the sun? Venus, Mercury, or Mars? In which year did the Battle of Hastings take place? 1066, 1666, or 1966? Who invented the light bulb? Was it Bell, Ford, or Edison? In which year did the Titanic sink? 1912, 1955, or 1991? What is the capital city of China? Shanghai, Tokyo, or Beijing? Who was the first man to walk on the moon? Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, or Michael Collins? What was the capital city of China? Shanghai, Tokyo, or Beijing? Which year did Did you get all that?
So, did you get all that? That wonderful video by the National Autistic Society, I think, gives a really good impression of what it can be like in a lecture theatre or even a meeting, sometimes as an autistic person. It seemed like a pretty good way to introduce what we're talking about today to get you all feeling in a more autistic frame of mind. This afternoon, I'm going to give you a whirlwind trip into how the story of autism forgot about women and what we can do about it today. First of all, and don't panic, but I am autistic. Usually telling people that causes a look of fear, a bit like Lance Corporal Jones here. But it's all right, and I'm here to tell you that there's nothing to worry about. However, you may be thinking, she doesn't look autistic to me. I get that quite a lot. Well, let's talk about why you may think that. So let's start with a little history. Here we have 4 key authors of the autism story who are at the center of our understanding of the condition today. Our story begins with Eugene Bleuler in 1908. Actually, he was the first person to use the term autism, but it was in relation to a schizophrenic patient who had withdrawn into his own world. Autism derives from the Greek word autos, which means self. So it literally means the state of being centered on oneself or being self-absorbed. It sounds a bit rude, right? But the term was used to describe patients who had actually stopped interacting with their own world. There's a big gap in our story now until the 1940s, when 2 of our key authors, Hans Asperger and Leo Kanner, in Austria and the US, came onto the scene. They worked independently of one another and began to define their own versions of autism, with Kanner studying a group of children with very obvious needs, and Asperger working with children who had these unusual gifts, but less apparent needs than those studied by Kanner. Asperger published his definition of what he called autistic psychopathy in 1944. He defined this condition using a sample of 4 boys with a consistent pattern of behavior and abilities, which he described literally as a lack of empathy, little ability to form friendships, one-sided conversations, intense absorption in a special interest, and also clumsy movements. He famously referred to these boys as little professors in relation to their focus and knowledge in one particular area of study. Sadly, some evidence has been found that Asperger actually handed some of these children that he studied to the Nazi-run clinic for sterilization and even child euthanasia. However, half a century later, his name was still given to the condition Asperger's syndrome, which I'm going to talk about a bit later. Kanner's paper, called Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact, was one of the most cited papers on autism in the 20th century. This was actually the first time the word autism had been used since Bleuler had used it to describe some adult schizophrenic patients. As a result, Kanner is viewed by many as the father of the modern definition of autism. Like Asperger, Kanner studied a small group of children for this paper. With this work, he actually fundamentally changed the definition of autism as being completely unrelated to schizophrenia and being something that people had since birth instead of a condition that developed over time because of something else. Asperger published his definition of what, we've done that one. Kanner concluded that the fundamental issues of autism was an inability of the children that he studied to relate to people and the world around them generally in the way that is considered normal. He referred to this trait as being a sort of extreme aloneness, meaning that children seem disconnected to the world. A little bit like dark matter. We know it's there, but it doesn't interact with matter in the way we expect. He also noted that the children he studied had behaviours that appeared to be governed by anxious and obsessive desire to create order or sameness in their environment. Many of the children also had amazing rote memories in certain subjects. Kanner would later come to blame a lack of maternal warmth for autism. So essentially, cold mothers caused autism. This is where the term refrigerator mother comes from. And for a while, mothers were led to believe that their love or lack of love could actually make their children autistic. It's ridiculous, isn't it? Both Asperger and Kanner did include girls in their studies of infantile autism, who displayed some similar difficulties and characteristics. And Kanner actually stated in 1971 that autism seemed to present differently in girls compared to how it did in boys. Despite that, neither he nor Asperger pursued those differences and instead concentrated on autism as a primarily male condition that was rarely observed in girls or women. Their subsequent studies were focused almost entirely on male patients. So as a diagnostic criteria for autism began to emerge from these studies, those studies that would become the basis of modern day diagnosis, women were forgotten. Our last chapter in this little history lesson is by Simon Baron Cohen. In 2003, he published a book called Essential Differences. In this book, he creates what we call the ES scale, where E stands for empathy and S for systematic. He hypothesizes that the male brain is programmed to systemize, whereas the female brain to empathize, putting them at opposite ends of his scale. He then goes on to say that autism represents the extreme male brain at the far S side of his ES scale. So autistic people are excessively male, essentially. Not too surprisingly, his work has been highly criticized for perpetuating gender stereotypes, but the essence of his vision has stayed in the public consciousness. So people with autism represent the extreme male mind. From that, you might be beginning to see the issue of female diagnosis. If you're not fixated on stereotypically male activities like categorizing different types of spanners while reciting pi to the 100th decimal place or something, you haven't got a chance. Not to mention that the story of autism is so powerful that some GPs even today believe that women cannot have autism, despite that simply not being true. So I'm going to play an excerpt from the film Rain Man, which, if you haven't seen, is about a man with fairly severe autism. Although it is a great film, unfortunately, it's taken its place in the public consciousness as a template of what an autistic person looks like, based very much on what we've just been talking about. Even if you haven't seen it, you'll definitely recognize it from your sort of cultural memory.
What am I supposed to do? There's got to be something that I can do here.
Well, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I do know that his brain doesn't work like other people. And what he does isn't intended to be annoying. If he's getting on your nerves, you just take a break. Spend some time away from him. Sure, I'll just send him back. Sorry?
No, it's just inside jokes. You're telling me I just have to deal with this stuff? Is that I just got to deal with this stuff?
Yeah, that's about it. Out of curiosity, does he have any special abilities?
I mean, he's got a pretty good memory. He counts toothpicks.
Huh?
Toothpicks. They spilled a box of toothpicks on the floor, and he took one look at them and knew exactly how many there were, and he counted them in seconds.
Huh. Ray. Raymond.
Yeah?
Are you good with numbers?
Yeah.
I read about this. I'm gonna try something here.
400 Oak Street. What did I tell you after this? After this.
Ray, can we try something?
Yeah.
Do you know how much 312 times 123 is?
38376.
He's right. What? He's right.
He's right?
Yeah. Ray, how much is 4,343 times 1,234?
5359262.
He's a genius, right? He's a genius. Ray, do you know how much the square root of 2,130 is?
46.15192304. 2304.
That's amazing. I mean, that is amazing. He should work for NASA or something like that.
If you had $1 and you spent 50 cents, how much money would you have left?
About 70.
70 cents?
70 cents.
So much for the NASA idea.
Go to Kmart. Just go to Kmart.
Right, after this, Ray.
Ray,
After this.
400 Oak Street.
Ray, do you know how much a candy bar costs?
About $100.
$100, huh?
Yeah,
You know how much one of those new compact cars cost?
about $100.
In his particular case, he's pretty well off. He's very high functioning. Most autistics, they can't speak and they can't communicate. Ray,
Yeah,
do you know what autistic is?
yeah,
You know that word?
yeah.
Are you autistic?
I don't think so. No.
My guess is that that clip felt familiar, and I think it sums up really well the idea of autism that people have in their minds. So here's what modern autism looks like. A few years ago in the DSM-5, that's the 5th version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is a mouthful, Asperger's syndrome was scrapped and made part of what is called Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD. The spectrum is generally used to determine the needs of an individual, with the Asperger's end generally referred to as high functioning, but that's not a term that actually many people on that end of the spectrum like. The question is, though, where do women fit in this model? Are they on some sort of hidden part of the spectrum that isn't visible to us for some reason? You may be asking by now, what exactly is the difference between male and female autism? That's a difficult question to answer, as there really is so much diversity. Of course, women can have some of the traits that you'll recognize, like obsessions in certain subjects, stimming behavior, that's when you might see someone making repetitive movements, and difficulties interacting in social situations. Much of those traits come from that need for order and sameness that Canna talks about. For me, watching a Doctor Who, a classic Doctor Who episode while reciting the script that I know because I've watched it so many times makes the world seem just a little bit safer. Similarly, some autistic people will have a person that they know so well that their actions and behaviours seem safe. For me, that's my mum. But the spectrum is very broad, and every autistic person has their own unique experience of it. So for a moment, let's have a look at the key diagnostic criteria from the DSM-5, which have been largely influenced by the work we've talked about. So this is literally what is used to diagnose someone as autistic by psychologists and psychotherapists. So we've got persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction, restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interests or activities. Symptoms must be present early development. I'm just going to leave out that word. You can read it. Symptoms must cause clinically significant impairment, and they can't be explained by any other intellectual disability. I find that actually quite difficult to take anything from in terms of what this person is like that they're trying to describe. The way I tend to explain autism to people is with a glass of water, actually, like this one, if it's not going to be invisible. If you imagine that the water in the glass is all the sensory input that you've had in the day, which you've been processing, and the empty portion is the capacity that you have left for more input. Most neurotypicals, or NTs, that's you, by the way, you have a label too, don't get anywhere near the top of the glass, at least not very often. Well, for autistic people, it's like constantly having water pouring over the brim of the glass while more and more is just pouring in. You can't process the input that's spilt all over the counter. Going back to the DSM-5 criteria, baked right into these lies much of why female autism is hidden. One of the most consistent traits reported by women with autism is their ability to effectively mask their autistic traits and social shortcomings. They can do this through techniques like mimicking the people they're talking to, like copying body language or length of eye contact. Many also plan out social interactions meticulously. Some could do this so well that you'd actually really never know that they had autism. We just blend right into the background. The reasons why women do this more than men is not really very well understood. It may come from differences in social motivation. So autistic women may want to engage socially more than men and so come up with more ways to do that. That may stem from different societal pressures that men and women grow up with women generally faced with pressures to be more socially active and maybe even more pleasing than their male counterparts. Essentially, it could be that society finds autistic men more acceptable than autistic women, and the difference could stem from that. Until I was about 20 years old, I didn't know I was autistic and thought everyone was as exhausted by social interactions as I was. I was always really embarrassed that I could only stay at an event for a short time or had to take days off just lying in a dark room after having just an hour-long conversation the day before, or was terrified of opening my emails as it felt like hundreds of people knocking on the windows all around me, shouting at me. I do my best to hide how hard I find it. A lot of the time, my brain doesn't take in what people are saying and I'm just guessing with my facial reactions. I like to think of the difference between how neurotypicals process conversational input and how autistic people do by thinking that neurotypicals have like a supercomputer in their heads running massive adaptive simulations while I'm trying to work it all out on a chalkboard. So obviously I make mistakes and miss parts out and come to the wrong answers sometimes. You can also imagine how exhausting that would be, doing that for hours every day while the supercomputers just hum in the background seemingly effortlessly. So I want to show you another video now from the National Autistic Society, which is based on the real experiences of a girl with autism. I think it's just brilliant and illustrates really well the lag that doing those conversation simulations in your head can cause and the consequences of it.
Perfect. Come on then, have a great day. Thanks for keeping an eye on it.
Off somewhere fun today? Are you all right?
What gift have you got, Sam? It's just a calculator.
Off somewhere fun today? Are you all right? Off somewhere fun today? You all right?
What gift did you get, Sam? Is it a calculator? Sorry, did he scare you? Is it a calculator? Sorry, yes, is it a calculator?
What are you doing? Trying to kill yourself? Are you right?
Have you seen a psychic fail? What's that, Mom? Seen a psychic fail?
Somewhere fun today? Are you all right? Dude, trying to kill yourself? Are you right?
Sorry, did he scare you? Is it a calculator? Sorry, did he scare you? I thought you were. We're out of packets. Do you want to see the special?
Are you okay? How can I help?
I'm autistic, and sometimes I get too much information.
So at first glance, masking may seem pretty advantageous as it allows many autistic women to engage with everyday life. Oh, wait a minute, I've lost my scene. There we are. It allows them to go through the motions of everyday life, like acting out some lifelong stage play. Asperger called the autistic boys in his study little professors, so maybe little actors is more appropriate for autistic girls and women. The people who know me would probably think I come across as smiley and maybe even funny in meetings. Little do they know that I'm constantly thinking when I should stop and start smiling, counting how long my eyes make contact with theirs, and I have to go and have a nap afterwards. Despite my best efforts, I'm quite certain that they all think I'm a bit odd though, and I have no doubt that I've miscalculated things at times. However, this unfortunately takes us to another very consistent trait in female autism, and that's a whole host of secondary mental health issues that come directly from their attempt to engage with, like a neurotypical person, with the world. The social and sensory experiences that women put themselves through are often exhausting, stressful, and bewildering. They're forcing themselves to interact in a way that they were not designed to do. These secondary mental health problems are often the reason why women with autism seek help and are misdiagnosed as primary conditions instead of secondary to their autism. So being diagnosed with autism can feel a bit like playing Wheel of Fortune. You're likely to be misdiagnosed with incorrect conditions and secondary conditions that are misinterpreted as primary ones. I've been diagnosed with every one of those conditions on that board before autism was even mentioned. Masking coupled with incorrect and secondary mental health diagnoses means that many women, like myself, are not diagnosed until adulthood, when the stresses of fitting into the workplace or university may start to overpower their masking and coping mechanisms. Many are not diagnosed at all. To give you an idea of how many that are not, in the 80s, the ratio of the number of women to men with autism was believed to be as extreme as 1 to 15. The most recent study suggests that number is more like 1 to 3, and it's constantly being revised towards parity. That's a lot of women who've fallen under the radar in that time. However, even if women are diagnosed as autistic, much of the help that exists is tailored towards male autism because of the historical baggage I talked about. So many diagnosed women are still left unable to access the support that they need. It's a twofold problem: the issue of being diagnosed and then later of inappropriate support. The result is that autistic women are left feeling like they don't fit into either the normal world or the ASD world either. Going to university and into the workplace can be an intensely stressful experience for autistic women, full of social expectations, structures, and rules that are not designed for the autistic brain. And many end up just giving up. So to continue, I have another short clip from the National Autistic Society, which is another fantastic depiction of a real life experience of how an autistic woman is being asked to fit in with everyday life and how that leads to overload.
This train is my bad.
I'm autistic, and the fear of unexpected changes can make leaving the house impossible.
I find that video in particular very powerful. There are some more fantastic videos on the National Autistic Society website if you want to have a look. They're really a wonderful charity. So next, what actually happens when you tell a disability department or your workplace that you're autistic? What exactly is it that they do? My experience of several universities' reactions to autism is, well, this essentially, that they want to put you in a box. Not usually, that's literally. You'll be asked to sit down with someone you don't know and choose from some predefined reasonable adjustments that they think that they will then email to a few people. Personally, I think this demonstrates a huge ignorance of autism and how broad it can be. And I don't mean just for women either. Once you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. There is no autism box, and it will affect everyone in a completely different way. And that way may change over time, it's not constant. In my opinion, the best way to create an environment that works for autistic women is by striking up real partnerships between student and supervisor, or whatever the situation is. Make it clear from the get-go that you're open to talking about autism and happy to discuss adjustments as they may arise, not putting anyone on the spot or in the spotlight, but by turning it into an ongoing, open conversation that they can come back to. It may take a while for that person with autism to take up that offer of talking about autism, and they may even need a while to think about what it is that they need. Like me, who was diagnosed quite late on in life, I had no idea what adjustments I needed when I first went to university. So it may take time and may naturally occur. It's important to leave that conversation open. So the key is, oh gosh, I've gone a slide ahead. The key is, don't be afraid of the A word, autism, I mean. My experience is people are pretty terrified when you bring it up, as it's built into our society just not to talk about it and to find neurodiversity an uncomfortable subject. So we don't. If you seem comfortable, it's more likely you'll be able to help someone with autism. Contrary to common belief, many autistic people are actually very good at picking up body language, and particularly women. We spend our whole lives watching it and learning from it. So we're very able to pick it up. So to finish off, do you remember that word cloud that you were asked to submit words to? Words that you think of when you think about autism? Well, here I have a word cloud that is made up of the words that women with autism have used to describe their autism in various online forums, blogs, and articles. They're drawn from places all over the place to look for keywords that keep cropping up when women are describing themselves. I think it just demonstrates what autism is like for the hidden part of the spectrum and how different it actually is from preconceptions. You'll see there that the biggest word is anxiety, which links very well to the fact that women with autism often have these secondary mental health issues that can actually hide their autism and mean that they don't get diagnosed until much later or at all. I'll leave you with a quote from one of my favorite authors, Kurt Vonnegut. If you've ever read any Vonnegut, you'll maybe understand how his unique way of representing time in this mixed up and confusing way speaks to someone with autism. I personally try and live by this quote from his book, Mother Night. We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful about what we pretend to be. As someone who spends a lot of time pretending, I've always considered it very good guidance. However, for the benefit of this talk, I'd like to change the wording a bit. Thank you.